After 45 years, the tale of Jimmy Hoffa has remained one of the most suspicious and intriguing cold cases in American mafia history. A number of theories have been tossed around, from hired hitmen, mob revenge, and even FBI witness protection, but the real truth has eluded investigators and mafia enthusiasts ever since he never came out on that fateful 1975 day. So, what really happened to Jimmy? Do investigators now know who actually killed him, or could he still be alive? Let's find out. Before we dive into the whodunit, we need to know who Jimmy Hoffa actually was and how he ended up with a target on his back in the first place. Born in the town of Brazil, Indiana, Hoffa's journey starts with the tough times he faced as a kid. His father, who was a coal miner, died at the hands of terrible working conditions in the mines. At this point, Jimmy was only 7 years old. Without dad around, he was forced to leave school at 14 and enter the workforce to support his family and make ends meet. That ignited the switch in Hoffa's brain that wanted to pursue fair working conditions for everyone. Ultimately, it was this activism that would become the start of his eventual demise, becoming a powerful union man who found himself knee-deep with the mob. It's a massive transition to go from hard-working teenager to a trustworthy enemy of the mob, though, right? Well, he continued to be active in the working community in his youth. He was organizing strikes at the Kroger grocery store in Detroit, and at 18, he managed to score pay rises for a group of dock workers by organizing another strike. A year later, in 1932, he was invited to join the local branch, number 299 of the Teamsters. For anyone unfamiliar, the Teamsters were one of the nation's largest labor union groups at the time. 90% of U.S. transportation was controlled by Teamsters, most of which was related to trucking. At that time, trucking unions were heavily influenced by organized crime. So for Hoffa to unify and expand trucking unions, he had to sit at the table alongside some very dangerous men. As Hoffa's influence in the organization grew into the late 30s and into the 40s, he found himself facing his first shady involvement. Detroit, being a key stop in the Midwest transportation system, was home to other organizations that Hoffa wasn't involved with. So in 1941, a turf battle between trucking rivals started to become problematic. What did Hoffa do? He went to the mob. After some time, he started to develop a relationship with the mob, which, if you've ever seen a mafia movie, hardly ever ends positively. By December 1946, Hoffa was the president of his local Teamsters branch, which meant he had more power and, of course, more access to money. Jimmy Hoffa would dip into the Teamsters pension funds and offer lower loans to the local mob, who'd usually funnel that cash into building Las Vegas casinos, and in return, Teamsters and Hoffa got pretty impressive returns on those loans. Even though the workers were aware of all of this, they didn't care, because they were getting benefits and pay raises that they hadn't even thought possible before Hoffa came on board. Hoffa continued to climb the ranks, eventually becoming president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957. Considering the influence unions had on the country, this made Hoffa one of the most powerful men in America. So the relationship with the mob was a strong and stable one in the 1940s and 50s, but things took a turn for the worse in 1964. Hoffa was convicted of attempted bribery of a grand juror, for which he was slapped with an 8-year jail sentence, and fraud, which added another 5 years on top. All up, he was given 13 years behind bars. Despite the imprisonment, Hoffa remained president of the Teamsters Union until 1971, refusing to relinquish the power. 1971 was about 5 years into his 13-year sentence, but it was also the year he got a literal get-out-of-jail-free card, thanks to one man, President Nixon. Following Hoffa's release, he was gifted a Teamsters pension of $1.7 million in cold hard cash. That's close to $11 million in today's value. Then came the fateful day, July 30th, 1975, the last time that Jimmy would ever be seen on planet Earth that we know of. Was it a coincidence that just 2 weeks earlier, federal investigators realized that the Teamsters pension fund had been robbed of hundreds of millions of dollars? So what exactly happened on the day that we last saw Hoffa? Well, we know that he was at his Detroit home in the morning, then reportedly left to have a 2 p.m. meeting at a restaurant called the Macus Red Fox. This was with Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone, two men heavily involved in the mob. At 2:15 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from a payphone complaining that he had been stood up. But of course, he wasn't. The next day after he didn't come home, his wife got worried and called Louis Linto, a close friend of Jimmy's, to check out the restaurant. Linto found Hoffa's car unlocked in the parking lot, but there was no sign of Hoffa nor sign of struggle. That day, on July 31st, the FBI was alerted. It turned out to be a wild goose chase, with Hoffa eventually presumed dead in 1982. Not because the authorities proved it, but because they couldn't prove that he was alive either. Now, there were obviously a number of question marks from that day. However, witness statements indicated that Hoffa may have driven away as a passenger in someone else's car. In a Mercury Marquis Brougham driven by his so-called friend Charles Chucky O'Brien. But during interrogations, O'Brien had denied being involved in Hoffa's disappearance at all. DNA tests suggest otherwise. In 2001, the FBI matched DNA from Hoffa's hair with a loose strand of hair found in Charles O'Brien's car. If that wasn't enough, German shepherds allegedly also found Hoffa's scent in the back seat of the trunk. Despite all this, O'Brien wasn't the main suspect. There were a number of theories circulating as to who could have been responsible for the heinous act. Many were under the impression that his disappearance was at the hands of the mob. When Hoffa got out of jail, the mob had already formed a relationship with Hoffa's successor, Frank Fitzsimmons. Since Hoffa wanted to return to his presidential position, they didn't want him to ruin the progress they'd made in his absence, especially considering how much money was changing hands. Furthermore, they were concerned that he'd rat to the Fed. Hoffa got out of jail close to 8 years earlier than expected, so it only makes sense that they were suspicious of collaboration with the authorities. They didn't want to take the risk, so they had to make him go away. Another theory floated was surrounding Tony Provenzano. A man named Donald Francos, an ex-mafia man who became an informant, insisted that Provenzano ordered a hit on Hoffa and that it was carried out by New York mobsters Jimmy Coonan and John Sullivan. Donald Francos also insisted that Chucky O'Brien, the so-called friend of Hoffa driving the Mercury, was there to lure Hoffa into the car. Hoffa trusted him, so why wouldn't he get in? On the surface, Francos' story made a lot of sense. However, he also believes that Hoffa's body is buried beneath the end zone of the Giants' NFL stadium. Another suspect was Richard Kuklinski, aka the Iceman. An author named Philip Carlo interviewed Kuklinski for hours on end and wrote about it in his book called The Iceman: Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer. Richard Kuklinski was a notorious hitman who confessed to killing Jimmy Hoffa in exchange for $40,000. Here's the issue, though. He wasn't the only one to confess. Around 100 others claimed to have killed Hoffa as well, so it becomes a case of he said, she said. For the majority of the investigation, the FBI believed that Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a self-professed hitman, was instructed by the mafia to execute Hoffa. Well, according to the FBI's 1976 Hoffex memo, the mob ordered the hit so that Hoffa wouldn't take back the position of the Teamsters union president. Now, to tie all this together to contemporary pop culture, in Martin Scorsese's new film The Irishman, spoiler alert, the character of Frank Sheeran confesses on his deathbed that he did indeed kill Jimmy Hoffa. Many think that's the be-all and end-all of it. Well, it's not. And here's why. That confession is based on hearsay and speculation. It's from the 2004 book by Charles Brandt, who was Sheeran's lawyer, called I Heard You Paint Houses, which has some doubt over its legitimacy. However, in 2005, the FBI investigated the house Sheeran described on his deathbed. They actually did find some blood, so it matched the story that was told by Sheeran, but the DNA was inconclusive, so it became a roadblock. On top of all that, Sheeran and Hoffa were actually very good friends at times. So if Sheeran was on his deathbed anyway, who's to say he wouldn't simply lie and falsely admit to the murder in order to distract everyone from Hoffa's real story? There aren't just theories about who did it, but also where the body lies today. As the result of what Marvin the Weasel Elkin said, Hoffa might have been thrown into the foundations of Detroit's Renaissance Center when the building was being cemented. Haunting, yet possible nonetheless. When the foundations were in place, tons of concrete flowed into them, and allegedly, at some point, someone slipped Hoffa's body into the wet cement, now encased under Detroit's most visible landmark. Meanwhile, according to Dan Moldea, a leading Hoffa expert and author, the body could be buried deep in a New Jersey landfill alongside barrels of chemical waste. What if he wasn't killed, though? What if instead, follow me here, he was put into FBI witness protection? It's possible. Henry Hill, a New York City mobster who inspired Scorsese's Goodfellas, was put into witness protection. He helped the FBI make 50 convictions. Same with Leroy Nicky Barnes, aka Mr. Untouchable, who turned over 109 names of criminals after being known as one of the biggest drug lords in American history. So, why rule out the idea of Jimmy Hoffa being in hiding after divulging information about the mob's antics? Perhaps the FBI had been circulating false rumors in order to throw people off the trail. It's a little far-fetched, but not impossible. For all we know, as many others theorize, he could have been alive and well, living the high life in Mexico until passing away naturally. In the words of U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider,
"It's unresolved. There will be more to come on this."
Frankly, we have an inkling that might just be right. Until we know more, this will continue to be one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime history.